booked in, then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Our book discussion for this episode will be on The Diary of a Young Girl, the definitive edition by Anne Frank and Miriam Pressler, and Anne Frank's Diary, the graphic adaptation, adapted by Ari Folman and illustrated by Dan Polonsky. Our guest this week is Karen, whom I taught with at West Point in the now defunct, or I guess farmed out, Department of English and Philosophy. Karen, welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners about yourself.
Hi, Naomi. It's nice to see you. Thanks for having me on. So my academic background, which is how we know each other, started in high school when I took AP English. English was my favorite subject back then. And I followed that path into college. I was an English major and worked in my college's writing center, which I really enjoyed doing, helping my fellow students work on their academic paper assignments. I followed that interest into graduate school, where I focused both on my master's degree and my doctorate in rhetoric and composition, which in everyday language is writing studies. Although not creative writing, we focused on academic writing, the study of writing, how to help people learn how to write, become better writers. So I became very interested in that field. And that's how we met. Was I ended up, as you said, working at West Point in the English and Philosophy department, which, as you said, has now been divided up and they're no longer one department. They're part of other departments now. After West Point, I moved on to North Dakota State University, where I was an associate director of the writing center there. And now I work as writer and editor professionally. That's my academic life in a nutshell.
Great. So before we begin our conversation, here's a brief overview of the definitive edition of the diary and its graphic adaptation. This 1995 edition of Anne Frank's diary restored approximately 30% of the material that was omitted from the original 1947 version that was published by Anne's father, Otto Frank. With the omitted material, the book provides a more complex and unvarnished look at Anne's life while hiding in the Secret Annex in Amsterdam from 1942 1944. The narrative follows Anne's transition from a social 13-year-old to a self-aware young woman. Key elements of this expanded edition include: first, interpersonal friction. The text details the intense claustrophobic tensions between the 8 residents of the annex, particularly Anne's difficult relationship with her mother and her frustrations with Mrs. Von Don. Developing identity. Anne writes candidly about her burgeoning sexuality, her changing body, and her evolving feelings for Peter Von Don. Third, self-reflection. The entries showcase Anne's ambition to be a professional writer and her habit of editing her own earlier entries, revealing a conscious literary effort rather than just a casual journal. Fourth, historical context. Amidst the personal musings, the diary captures the looming terror of discovery and the psychological toll of the escalating war and the Holocaust. The graphic novel adaptation, authorized by the Anne Frank Fond, the foundation established by Otto Frank, in 2008, uses vibrant visual storytelling to interpret Anne's inner world. It balances the grim reality of the annex with imaginative, surreal sequences that illustrate her dreams, humor, and internal monologues. The history of the censorship and banning of Anne Frank's diary is a study in how the same text can be challenged for vastly different reasons, ranging from its emotional weight to its candid portrayal of a young woman's body and identity. The first bans were actually acts of protective editing by Otto Frank. In the 1947 publication, his reasons were largely personal. He removed Anne's harshest criticisms of her mother and the other residents of the annex, even though none of them had survived the Holocaust. He edited out Anne's reflections on her changing body, menstruation, and her curiosity about sexuality, which were considered taboo for a general audience in the 1940s and 50s. As the book became a staple of school curricula, it faced its first formal challenges in the United States. In 1982, in Virginia, parents in Wise County called for a ban, arguing that Anne's descriptions of her own anatomy and her, quote, offensive, unquote, criticisms of adults undermined parental authority. In 1983, in Alabama, in one of the more unusual challenges, the Alabama State Textbook Committee sought to reject the book simply because it was a, quote, real downer, unquote, arguing that students shouldn't have to focus on such depressing historical realities. The release of the definitive edition in 1995, which restored the passages Otto Frank had originally removed, ignited efforts to restrict the book. Because this version included Anne's clinical curiosity about her body and her musings on her attraction to other girls, challengers began labeling the work as, quote, pornographic, unquote. In Texas in 1998, it was briefly removed from a middle school library after parents labeled the restored passages as, quote, obscene, unquote. Modern challenges, the 2010s to 2020s, often target the definitive edition specifically. In 2013, a Michigan parent unsuccessfully lobbied for schools to revert to the older expurgated version to avoid the, quote, graphic, unquote, descriptions of puberty. The current climate and the graphic novel from about 2022 to 2024, these efforts have shifted. Because the adaptation is visual, it has become a flashpoint in broader debates over, quote, sexually explicit, unquote, materials in schools. In 2022 and 2023, in Texas and Florida, several districts removed the graphic novel following complaints that it was, quote, age inappropriate or minimized, unquote, the Holocaust. In one notable 2023 case in Texas, a teacher was reportedly fired for assigning the graphic adaptation to an 8th grade class. As we reflect on the many versions of Anne's diary, from the first edited editions to the restored definitive text and the recent graphic adaptation, it becomes clear that the efforts to challenge this work often stem from a discomfort with the raw, unfiltered reality of a young person's growth. Whether the objections are rooted in the difficult nature of the Holocaust or the candidness of Anne's own development, these attempts to restrict her voice only underscore why her writing remains so vital. By engaging with the full breadth of her thoughts, we honor not just a symbol of history, but a complex, ambitious, and deeply human writer whose words continue to demand our attention. So to start our conversation, what drew you to this specific book, and why did you feel it was important to discuss it now?
So, in terms of why I wanted to discuss this book now, that was really just because of your request for volunteers to be on your podcast. Thinking about it more intellectually, this book talks about the Holocaust, which is a genocide of Jewish people, which is extremely troubling and disturbing event that happened. And in our current geopolitical situation, Israel is allegedly, by some, engaging in a Holocaust against Palestinian people in the Middle East in their military hostilities against the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Iran, Lebanon, and we're seeing oppression and suppression of discussions about this topic in the name of anti-Semitism, so that any questioning about the actions that Israel is taking are immediately labeled anti-Semitic, hearkening back to the anti-Semitic actions against Jews during the Holocaust. And so there is a relevance in terms of today's geopolitical situation, certainly, but that wasn't my primary motivation for picking this book. What motivated me to pick the book was when you were seeking people to participate, you published a list of books that we could choose from to talk about. And given my academic background, and when I looked at the list, I've read many, many, many of those books on that list. Either I've read them in classes I've taken or I've taught them in classes that I've taught. And so I thought, wow, how am I going to pick a book out of all these choices? But when I saw this book on the list in particular, it really resonated. I think because when I first read it, I was about the age that Anne was when she wrote it. I read it in my first year of high school when I was 14 years old as part of a class called Moral Problems. I went to a Quaker school for high school, which was run by the Society of Friends, and we needed to take a religion class as a graduation requirement. And you could take a class on the history of Quakerism or world religions. I chose this one called Moral Problems. And out of that class, the only two books I can remember are The Diary of Anne Frank and Night by Elie Wiesel. Now, we must have read other books or at least other articles, and we must have discussed other moral problems than just the Holocaust because the class was called Moral Problems, not Moral Problem. But I don't remember them. These two books really stuck with me, and of the two, the diary stuck with me more. As I said, I think because I was her age when I was reading it. I was of the age that she was when she wrote it. And many years later, as an adult, I was fortunate to go to Amsterdam for a conference. And during one of my off days, I was able to go on a tour of Anne Frank's hiding place where the family hid during the Holocaust. It's now a museum, and to walk the same rooms and see the same furnishings and the same decor, it was just really moving, having read the diary first. And so that's why I picked the book, I think because of the emotional impact that it had on me when I first read it, and then years later when I actually went to see The Hiding Place.
I think I first read the play when I was in high school. I don't think I actually read the diary until I was reading the definitive edition for this recording. And I also want to note that I appreciate you using the word allegedly when talking about people saying that Israel is committing genocide. They were provoked and they are a sovereign nation with the right to defend themselves. Though I think many of us can say that they have been overly aggressive in that defense. I try to stay away from the discussion of whether or not what Israel is doing is genocide, because I fall on a certain side of that discussion because I am a Jew. And I don't think that what Israel is doing has the same methodical nature as what the Nazis perpetuated in the Holocaust with the final solution. It's a hard needle to thread. So I appreciate that.
And I'm not a political science expert by any means or a military expert by any means. I just know that this book does seem to have some heightened relevance now, given the tensions and hostilities and armed military actions that are going on involving a group of people or the government representing a group of people, to be more precise,
Right.
that was brutally repressed and decades ago. It's a conundrum and puts an interesting light on the reading of Anne's life, I think. What's now happened all these years later.
Because it's just a very complicated situation all around. And I think we can be more definitive about what happened with the Nazis and the Third Reich, um, which may not have seemed as definitive when people were experiencing it. So, as mentioned, the 1995 definitive edition restores about 30% of the text that was originally omitted. How does seeing Anne's frustrations and her more difficult personality traits change our understanding of her as a historical figure?
You know, for me, in order to prepare for this conversation, I actually reread the original version and then the two newer versions. And I didn't really sense a huge difference between the first two. I actually had a hard time figuring out what had been added, not entirely, but in some places I was like, "Was that in the original? I can't remember." And to be honest, I didn't go take the time to compare page to page what had been changed. Although it does say in the definitive edition that there is also something called the critical edition, which reprints in its entirety several different versions of the diary. And I think that would be fascinating to look at them side by side like that. There are also critical analyses included apparently in that edition, and that would be fascinating. So at some point, I want to look up that book and read it. Between the first two editions, the original and the definitive, I didn't get a very different sense of Anne as a person. I thought she was pretty well developed in the original. You got a good sense of who she was. I didn't think they left out so much that she seemed fake or a facade or anything like that. So I didn't notice a huge difference. I did have more of a reaction to the illustrated or graphic version, but I think we have a question about that later, so I'll hold off on addressing that.
Having not read the original edition from her father and just trying to remember what I knew of the play, which I think took a lot of liberties with the story. And of course, it was greatly, greatly condensed. I really enjoyed getting to know Anne as a person in the definitive edition. And maybe it doesn't have as much to do with her being a historical figure, but with being a human being.
Yes, you definitely get a sense of her as a complex, real, rounded human being in both
Yeah.
versions, I think.
Yeah. Well, and the play does not do that at all. It's not deep enough, I don't think. Anne's descriptions of her changing body and her curiosity about her identity are often the primary targets for modern challenges. Why do you think these universal experiences of growing up are still viewed as, quote, inappropriate, unquote, by some?
I'm not entirely sure because to me they're not inappropriate. They're just a description of reality and the confusions that people have as they develop hormonally, physically at that stage of life. Their yearnings for either the same sex person or opposite sex people. Different people have different experiences with that, and she describes her own personal experience. But I think why people maybe are made uncomfortable by that, again, I can only speak hypothetically because I'm not made uncomfortable by them myself. But I think it has to do with wanting to protect innocence or delicateness or fragility somehow. So when infants are born, they're helpless. They're completely helpless. They're completely reliant on their parents. And as they start to grow, they become cute and cuddly, and that's deliberate. That happens throughout all mammals. Baby kittens are cute so that their parents will take care of them, and baby puppies and cute little apes in the zoo. They're all cute little animals to create this desire for the parent to attend to them because babies are a lot of work. Otherwise, they might just abandon them and say, I'm not dealing with this thing. It's really hard work to raise this thing and keep it alive. So they're deliberately cute, which triggers our desire to protect and love and nurture this cute little thing. And as it grows and moves beyond that little cute stage into adolescence, the parent still remembers that cute little innocent, helpless baby. And so their impulse to protect is still there, even though the child is now developmentally past that stage. And so I think that maybe has a lot to do with it. Somehow, some adults find discussions of sexuality or even anatomy, as you pointed out, that was not included in the original version, is just a very clinical description of the female genitalia and what it looks like objectively. Maybe adults feel awkward. They think, oh, this little child, they're imagining their 14, 15-year-old kid as that baby and think they're too young to think about that at this age. And I want to protect them from these complications that are going to come up when we talk about these things. And it's just difficult and hard. And now that's another human impulse is we want things to be simple and easy. And life isn't. Life is hard and complicated. And so the impulse to make things simple and easy and avoid the hard and complicated is really strong in human beings for some reason, which is misguided, sadly, because it makes life harder for these kids that are overprotected. And then at some point, they're going to face something hard or challenging or difficult or confusing and have to know how to deal with it. And if they've been protected from it their whole life, they won't have any of those skills built up in how to deal with it. So my own approach would be to be more open and allow discussions of these topics. But I think a lot of people have fear and the desire to protect children or young adults from scary, dangerous topics.
I think you're right about that for sure. I just look back on my own teenage years. My mother had no idea what I was reading. None. Maybe I have this perspective that I think our teenagers are a lot more savvy than parents give them credit for and are actually able to handle a lot more things than we give them credit for. And I also think it's important for the kids that are in less than ideal home situations for whatever reason, whether they're discovering that they have a queer identity and that may not necessarily be acceptable in their family, or their home life is abusive in some way, or they're having depressive episodes. I think it's important that they are able to access that information through fiction because in and of itself, fiction is identity building. We can see somebody else's life and think about how would I react in that situation? How would I not react? Or maybe I want to be the way that this person is in a certain situation. So I do think that there is value, as you were saying, in having these books available, and that we're not necessarily protecting kids as much as we think we are. In the diary, Anne often writes about her desire to be a famous writer. And when we look at the literary quality of her entries, how does her conscious effort to edit and refine her work affect how we view the diary today?
Again, I didn't really get a great sense of her edits. There were a few clearly indicated with italics that she had gone back later and added in a few more comments. It's revealed in the foreword of the definitive edition that she had written two versions of her diary. She had written one that was like a true diary. It was meant to be for herself and herself only, and she mentions that several times in the diary that I'm only writing this because no one else is going to look at it. She calls her diary Kitty. I'm telling you, Kitty, these things because I don't want to say them to the actual people that I'm writing about. I want to keep them ignorant of my true feelings towards them. I want to share this only with you. And so she writes a very private, personal diary. Then, when they hear that in the future after the war, there might be a chance to publish some diaries that people kept during the war, apparently, as the forward explains, she went back and did some edits to create a second version of the diary. She changed names to make them anonymous, and she went back and made some changes. It's a little hard to tell based on what's actually now been published how many of those changes were Anne's and how many were Otto's and how many are the latest editors. So it's hard to tell who's responsible for which changes, to be honest. And it brings up for me a lot of questions, even with the original publication. When I first read that when I was 14 years old, I thought it was Anne's diary. I thought it was that A version that she wrote just for herself that she never wanted to have be public. And it's only now that I'm realizing that what Otto did was take parts of the one that was meant to be private and parts of the one that were meant to be public and publish those as her diary. And so it makes me wonder, well, why didn't he publish only the public version? Why did he take anything from the private version if she really wanted that to be private? So that I have a lot of questions about authorship and editorship and the ethics of all of that. And I think I'm getting away from what your original question was, but that's what those edits and changes triggered for me. And I suppose it's a realistic depiction to some extent of what writers have to go through because in the publishing process, they have to work with editors who want to make changes to their words and their design of their writing. And so I guess she actually finally made it posthumously as a as an author, and an experience without realizing it, what a lot of writers do actually experience.
I think that's a really interesting perspective that she did go through what a lot of writers experience, even though some of that editing, well, a lot of the editing took place after she had died. She did become a famous writer, though probably not in the way any of us would have liked for her to become one. But I also feel like if she'd survived the Holocaust, it's hard to say whether her diary, if she published her own edited version of it, would have become as famous as it is today. One hopes it would have, but I think also sometimes that when a tragedy is attached to something, it might increase its value for other people, which is unfortunate, but realistic. The graphic novel adaptation uses a visual medium to interpret Anne's inner thoughts. And I also thought it did a great job in a practical way. I couldn't imagine the annex in my head in a coherent way, not just based on reading the description. So the graphic novel was really key for me understanding, oh, this room is over here and this room is upstairs, and the shared spaces and the unshared spaces and what they were doing in and out of the factory and in the annex. So I really appreciated that. But in your view, speaking of the graphic adaptation, does this format make the history more accessible, or does it add a layer of interpretation that complicates the original narrative?
I think it does both. As you're saying, it made it easier to visualize the space that she was describing. And it also, they took actual photographs of these people and drew them as people in the book, so you could see what they looked like instead of having to guess or imagine. I guess that detracts from the imaginative part of reading that we often like when we just read words on the page, but it did enhance the accuracy, I guess, of what we would see when we read it in the graphic version. So it was enhancing in that way, I would say. But to me, it was also detracting, especially in its depictions of Peter and Mrs. Von Don, because as the authors explained in a postscript or afterward, it was very challenging for them to take these really complex descriptions of these people that are spread out throughout the diary and present them in a comic book type format, where you have little panels with just few words and some pictures to try to capture Anne's complex feelings about these other people. And I thought it really overstated her criticisms of Peter. He was really portrayed in that version as this weak, sniveling, complaining crybaby, really, which is not at all how I interpreted him based on either of the other two versions. He did have some moments of fear, I guess, but he also had moments of real bravery, and she provides a much more complex analysis of him in the original version and the definitive version. And the other person that I thought it did gave short shrift to and misrepresented Anne's attitude towards was Mrs. Von Don. Well, certainly she had misgivings about Mrs. Von Don. She feels in the other two versions that she's picked on by Mrs. Von Don, constantly criticized by Mrs. Von Don, and she doesn't think too highly of Mrs. Von Don. She doesn't think she's a very smart person. She thinks she's overly vain. She thinks she's overly flirtatious. Um, so in the original two versions, one of the observations Anne makes about Mrs. Von Don is the object, her primary object that she brought with her to the hiding place. She talks about what everyone brought to the hiding place, and she talks about how she brought herself mostly sentimental items, her diary, cherished knickknacks. She talks about how her sister brought very practical clothing, focused on that, and kind of prompted Anne, don't you want to bring some dresses with you or something to wear? But with Mrs. Von Don, she said she brought her own chamber pot. And she thought this was very strange, and why on earth would someone pick this as their item to bring with them? It turns out it was a very practical item. They often needed to use chamber pots because they couldn't flush the toilet during the day or people in the building would hear, and they actually had to jury rig their own chamber pots out of canning jars because they didn't have enough actual chamber pots to use for all of them. And so it turned out to be a very practical thing. And she just mentions it once in passing. But in the illustrated version, every time they drew Mrs. Von Don, she's sitting on her chamber pot. And it's like obsessive almost, and really highlighting this small detail that she had in the diary. And so I felt like that misrepresented Anne's attitude towards that.
Anne does have a couple of moments, maybe they were only moments, where she feels kindly toward Mrs. Von Don and they have some conversations. Though for the most part, she does feel that she's the object of criticism from Mrs. Von Don. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there was that dynamic of both. And there's also this horrible feeling when you're stuck with the same 8 people day in and day out. You tend to get on each other's nerves, at least at some point, and we definitely see that happening. So the Secret Annex was a place of extreme confinement and constant fear. How do the interpersonal conflicts between the 8 residents reflect the psychological toll of their situation?
I can only imagine what it must have been like for 8 people to be living in this small space. Now, they did have access to the rest of the building at night, although that was risky. There are times in the book where there are robbers in the building and they have to hide from them, and they're constantly worried that people in neighboring buildings might hear them as they're roaming around the rest of the building. So, that for the most part, I think they stayed in their small annex space. Yes, they had to deal with their own interpersonal conflicts within their individual families because there was Anne's family of 4, the Von Don family of 3, and then an additional adult who was there. And so they had their own family dynamics within those groupings to deal with. Plus, the 2 families, I didn't get the sense were best friend type families. The 2 fathers worked together in the company, and that I think is why they ended up in hiding together, not so much because they were best buddies or close friends or anything like that. They're kind of acquaintances. They see each other at work. Who knows if they ever saw each other outside of work before they went into hiding together, but to have to be in hiding for several years with people that you kind of barely know, maybe have very different personalities. I can only imagine how stressful that must have been. And I
Well,
think
and
Anne uses her diary as an outlet for that stress. And so it's dangerous, I think, to assume that her every interaction in day to day life was exactly like what she writes in her diary. It's hard to know. As you said, she does talk about some almost oddly pleasant times where they sat around a radio listening to music and playing games together and reading together. They did have moments and times of peace and tranquility and getting along all right, but overriding all of that must have been this just intense stress of interpersonal relationships plus the danger of the war.
I can't imagine that the totality of that situation and even Anne's diary can't capture all of those moments, right? It's still limited in its scope. So we've seen challenges to this book for decades, from its quote depressing unquote nature to its so-called graphic content. What do these shifting reasons for censorship tell us about the anxieties of the eras in which they occurred?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure. I think because we see different types of challenges across different eras. So we see concerns about exposing young people to hard, sad historical times, not just in the past, but also now. People have said, well, this is, too hard, psychologically challenging for young people to be exposed to. And so I'm not sure that certain challenges are limited to certain eras. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure either. I mean, I feel that, as we've already discussed, this idea of Anne discovering her own sexuality and trying to clinically figure out what's happening to her body while she's in the throes of puberty. I think people are always going to react to that, which is unfortunate. I would hope that we could get to a place where people realize that kids need this information and they like reading about what other kids may have written about their own experiences. My other sense is that, especially in the United States, we have a political climate and have had for quite some time that doesn't want certain groups, particularly groups who come from a place of privilege, to feel uncomfortable. And that is the more disturbing element, I think, to me. I think that literature is supposed to make us feel uncomfortable so that we question the world around us and so that we think about people who live lives that are more marginalized and less privileged than our own. And if we try to get rid of literature that make us feel uncomfortable, then we tend to learn less about others, and we also tend to learn less about ourselves.
One thing I found interesting in terms of Anne's expression of her sexuality in the original version that Otto edited himself are included her yearnings for another girl before they went into hiding. She talks about wanting to kiss this girl, wanting both of them to explore each other's bodies. And she also talks about similar feelings towards a boy before they went into hiding. And then while they're in hiding, she has feelings for another boy. And all of that is included in the original version that Otto published. It's only the very clinical anatomical description of female genitalia and also some description of male genitalia when they're in hiding and they're looking at a tomcat, the tomcat's genitalia, and Peter is explaining to Anne what that's all about. Some of that is excluded from the original. And so I found that really interesting, and I wondered if maybe Europe was more accepting of sexual exploration, same-sex sexual exploration, and than people in America were at that time. And since he was in Europe, he had no problem exposing that Anne had these feelings for both girls and boys. I don't know. It was very interesting to me because I would have expected, as an American, hearing about what life was like in the 1940s and 50s and knowing firsthand what life is like now, I would have thought that some of those descriptions would have been edited out of the original version, and they weren't. And so that was really interesting to me.
First of all, I probably have an erroneous vision of Europeans in my mind as being a little more earthy in some ways than Americans are. Maybe a little less prudish is a better way to say that. But I also wonder if it's not that Anne having feelings about other girls would not have necessarily been considered queer at that time. It's this idea that a girl crush now and then, that's just normal. It's a part of growing up. I don't know. I don't really
Whereas
know.
if something now were published like that, in the United States anyway, I think it would be banned.
Yeah, and frequently is, and frequently is. So, as we wrap up, what is the legacy you hope readers take away from Anne's writing for today?
I guess it has to go back to that idea of how life is so complex, and that in this diary, she's writing about a really horrific time in world history. And she's experiencing it firsthand. And she is exposing in her diary some really difficult feelings and difficult experiences that she's going through. But at the same time, she is exploring love with a boy and listening to beautiful music and appreciating nature. That's a really strong theme in her diary, is the healing power of nature, and how nature can make us feel better in hard times. And they look out cracks in the windows to see the leaves on the trees. And so there's this really interesting juxtaposition happening throughout the diary of hard times and beauty. And I just think it really illustrates the complexity of life really well.
Yeah, I think so too. Karen, thank you so much for all of your thoughts about the Diary of Anne Frank, both the definitive edition, the original, and the graphic adaptation. Our next episode will be a discussion of the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. We're doing the whole series, not just The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Thank you for joining us today. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear.